So thanks, Deb. So welcome everybody to this introductory seminar to the Collecting the West seminar series. This is a little group of papers that we wanted to bring together to motivate us to keep writing as we can't catch up face to face as a group as much as we would like. And so we have a set of papers over the next few weeks, and I've listed some of those there on the right. So, and there's information on all the various social media channels to find out more. I will ask people to mute their computers and devices, and just note that, of course, this seminar is being recorded as well. And if you have any questions and comments along the way, you can add them to the chat room if you want, and Tiff can kind of chair. Tiff Shellham is agreed to chair any questions and things at the end. So today it'll be Andrea and myself talking, or perhaps not talking. Let's have a look. About the project. I'll just start by acknowledging, of course, we're on various country around Australia, around the world. In particular, I'm on Noongar Budja, and I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this place, but of course all of the other various traditional owners around Australia as well. All right, so today we're doing a bit of an update on Collecting the West. It's going to be Andrea Witcomb from Deakin and myself. We are leading the project, and so it's a nice opportunity for us to once again perhaps talk about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and where we're at. And we also have Toby Burrows. I don't know if Toby is on the Zoom today. We have a set of slides from him from earlier in the year, so they're a little bit out of date, talking about our database. So I just wanted to acknowledge that before we start. So Andrew and I will be moving backwards and forwards, and we'll see how we go in terms of our choreography and in relation to that. So we'll start by talking about the basis for the project and run through some aspects of our research. I've jumped forward already too quickly. We're in our final year of a 4-year project. We've extended it on, so it's actually nearly a 5-year project, and that's really due in part to COVID and some of the disruptions around it. So we're hoping to finish in the middle of next year, when the Umaga Museums and Galleries Conference is being held in WA, and we're hoping to be involved in that in May, June, in the middle of next year. But to start with, we'll go back to 2012, and that's when we brought a group of people together at UWA from museums and galleries to talk about collections. And at that time, the Australian Research Council, who have funded this project, were increasingly interested in research impact and the cultural sector, particularly the ways in which the GLAM sector, galleries, libraries, archives and museums, could make a research impact. And we looked very closely at what was happening in the UK, where there was at that time an emerging model where larger collecting institutions such as the British Museum were able to compete with universities for Category 1 funding and also be involved in PhD supervision. This week, in continuing that trend, Britain's Arts and Humanities Research Council, as some of you would be aware, announced $27 million in funding for this project towards a national collection, which has 5 separate projects, one of which involves the Collecting the West project. We're very honoured to be asked to be involved in this, the Sloan Lab, looking back to build shared collections. So this project will look at the Sir Hans Sloane, but the important thing, I think, is to note that this is an exercise that we're very much interested in the Collecting the West project as well. And so we will continue to look towards other examples internationally of how people are bringing together collections and doing collections research in ways that makes, I guess, new ways to search and explore and engage critically with cultural heritage. And the Sloan Lab, because it's dealing with Sloan, actually is something that deals with something which is rather iconic to us as well. And right at the start of the project, we started thinking about William Dampier. So the collections of Sloan led to the establishment of the British Museum, and Sloan was enmeshed with Western Australia through William Dampier, who was collecting here in 1688 and 1699 on the West Australian coast. He's a bestseller, as we know, a naturalist, a licensed buccaneer, and importantly, a collector. And his collections of plants and animals circulated through the hands of well-heeled collectors in the United Kingdom, in London, eventually ending up in Oxford. And the plants on the left from the Dampier Archipelago from Murujuga are some of the oldest collected objects surviving from Australia anywhere outside of Australia. Beyond Sloane, Collecting the West has more to bring to these types of stories, as well as working on reconnecting Sloane's Australian collections to catalogues. Collecting the West reveals how the creation of national collections is a larger global story of networks through which collections circulated. And these are stories of empire and globalization, the birth of Western institutions, Indigenous peoples' knowledge, scientific knowledge, and the developments of boundaries between the constructions of nature and culture. So our project grew from that 2012 meeting. We designed a project that focused on Australian collections, West Australian collections, beginning with Western Australia as a frame of reference. And to our knowledge at that time, this was the first attempt to study collecting at the level of a state, not confined by collection types, the animal, the vegetable, the mineral frames, or indeed the split between nature and culture. And we are proud to be working with the state's key institutions. So through partnership with the WA Museum, the WA Art Gallery and the State Library of Western Australia, and providing a platform for us into Europe, the British Museum. Finally, we also opened up the timescale, working across 4 centuries through to the present. Andrea.
So of the raft of issues that relate to the field of collections research today, there are 3 significant developments that framed our thinking. The first was the theoretical attention to collections, particularly growing awareness that collections and the history of information have much to tell us about the histories of empire, colonialism, nation building, and the nature of cross-cultural encounters in these contexts. So much of this work has been interested in the role of collections and their constitution in colonial settings. From Nicholas Thomas's 1994 Colonialism's Culture, Anthropology, Travel and Government, the work has also been concerned with creating a place for Indigenous perspectives, historically as well as now. Central to this effort have been attempts to understand how the history of collecting other cultures and the natural world offers particularly revealing insights into imperial encounters and entanglements, colonialism, governance, and the emergence of capitalism. We're interested in what, as are the people that sort of do work in this area, in what motivated the collection of objects in imperial settings. What was the place of local populations, of local agents, of donors and collectors themselves? And what happened to knowledge related to collections when placed in museums? Projects such as the Relational Museum at the Pitt Rivers Museum, Oxford, and Kew Gardens' The Economic Botany Collection Project revealed a wide variety of actors involved in global collecting networks and the role of institutional collections and the emergence of disciplinary fields and disciplinary-based collections in the 19th century. Australia proved an aspect for the creation and development of these iconic institutions. What perhaps they did not realize at the time that these collections were formed was that these dormant collections carried the seeds of future politics, of course, because they were created in the various colonial, imperial, and racial parameters of the 19th and early 20th centuries. So what happened to the knowledge related to these collections when placed in museums? Today in Europe, there is a growing call for the return of colonial era collections. President Macron has put this on the political and legislative stage. Debate on restitution rages in Germany, in Holland, and the UK, for example. These difficult conversations are not restricted to ethnographic museums. The Science Museum Group in the UK stated in 2020, for example, that the choices we make about what to research can help us to understand the role of objects in our collection had in supporting colonial structures and the new roles the collection might play in creating spaces that are open for everyone. Other work that informed our own thinking is concerned with institutional histories, with museums as institutions, their relationship to emerging disciplines and to forms of colonial and national governance. So we're particularly interested in the emergence of Enlightenment thinking and its impact on natural history and forms of science. In Australia, examples of this kind of work might include the histories of Museum Victoria and the Powerhouse Museum, for example. But Tony Bennett's book, The Birth of the Museum, is a kind of broader, really intellectual history of that relationship between disciplines and the formation of institutions and their relations to histories of empire and colonialism. Now, the second issue that framed our discussions was this: the need to establish the provenance of collections in order to address claims for restitution. So the specific work on repatriation and cultural ownership has sharpened, of course, in recent years. And set against this are the visions and claims for the future of museums and collecting institutions. The repatriation of human remains for Australia has seen research into institutional collections for decades now, as detailed in the recent volume, The Routledge Companion to Indigenous Repatriation, Return, Reconcile and Renew, that you can see there. But given the extensive and ongoing work, our project did not focus on human remains in collections. We have, however, gathered a lot of information on both natural and cultural material extracted from Western Australia and dispersed across the globe. And in Australia, the historical dispersal of objects across museums, nationally and internationally, makes relationships building and reconnection a challenge to communities and museums alike, leading to important conversations and collaborations going on today. So, for example, a recent collaboration that we are very much aware of because of Gay Sculthorpe's involvement in it is the 2012 research for an exhibition at the NMA titled Encounters, revealing stories of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander objects from the museum. The Menang community in Albany, where the material came from, expressed a desire for all Menang objects held by the British Museum to return to country for a visit. And the resulting exhibition that Gay was very much involved in, called Yeoman Mokara Miyabudja, or Returning to Mokara's Home Country, was conceived. These objects were collected by government resident Dr. Alexander Colley in the 1830s. During his time in Menang country, he developed a special friendship with Menang leader Mokara, and thus built this collection of objects that ended up in the British Museum. And then we also have going on right now the Return of Cultural Heritage project at IATSIS, which has been funded millions of dollars to locate material to be returned to community. So we're interested in the fact that given the vast amount of material held overseas, we're interested in asking what are the various future pathways for these materials.
The third aspect that informed our work was, of course, the digital side of things, which is a fast-moving field. And I'll just kind of overview some of the issues here. There is a shift towards looking at museum and other collections data in this big data moment, such as ideas regarding open data, particularly collections that are held by the state, GovHack and other initiatives really been part of that kind of opening up of data, opening up of the digital archive. There's also the issue of connections. So the ways in which libraries and archives and galleries and museums can potentially link to each other, typically running, of course, not only separate databases for each institution, but in most cases, actually multiple separate databases within institutions as well. So many, many technical and also kind of philosophical issues that sit around connecting data. A great example in here would be the Living Atlas which brings together biological information across Australia in different collections. Another emerging issue, which some will be aware of, is, of course, the nature of databases, the ways in which ideas such as the semantic web and research data commons are leading into and involving collections data. Issues around that involves issues around data mining, the use of AI and other tools for opening up the data as well. And of course, alongside of this, the issues regarding ethics and open data, particularly in the relationship of material, which in some instances is restricted or closed according to gender or other cultural practices. And also this idea of digital repatriation, which is probably seen work, for instance, Jane Lydon's work with her colleagues looking at Aboriginal photographs in certain European collections and the ways in which they've reconnected the digital instances of those images with community. So at the outset, here are some of the questions that we asked, and they're still driving us, I think, forward, though we'd probably craft them differently now, as inevitably. But we really knew very little about the nature of the making of collections from and in Western Australia, the institutional, political and social context of individual collectors, or the role of these collections in the creation of knowledge about Western Australia, the shaping of its social relations, or the production of collective memories and a sense of place over the course of Western Australia's history to the present. And there was also some important reasons in terms of things going on in Western Australia that kind of made this the right time for this project. One being the work done on the new museum, Boulevard at Many Voices, opened in 2020 on time during a pandemic. So an important kind of aspect was feeding into that process, but equally the art gallery and WA Museum both celebrated their 125th anniversary as well in 2020, having been established jointly in 1895. And the State Library as well had emerging interests in storylines, which is a project to identify, explore and return Aboriginal heritage material from the collections. And they wanted specific work looking at some of the aspects of their Indigenous collections as well. We assembled a team of researchers, particularly from Deakin and UWA, and members of our partner organisations, and you can see details of the team on our website, bringing together lots of different disciplinary interests and curatorial interests, and working across a range of research core to the project. So some of this work obviously addresses the needs and concerns of the partner organisations. And I guess this kind of project is really a testament to the nature of the linkage program, the linkage scheme, which is intended to forge ongoing and productive links between industry, in this case, the cultural industry, the cultural sector, and universities. And of course, cultural and collecting organisations are significant industries in both the economic and cultural life of Australia, and we're very attentive to that. So something like the new museum project, a large number of WAM staff joined the project, including the CEO, Alec Cole, and Deputy CEO, Di Jones. So showing a real strong interest in the research that feeds back into the museum. Other investigators include Kate Gregg, the Batty librarian, and the manager of collections at AGWA, Melissa Harpley, and from the British Museum, Gay Sculthorpe, and the head of research, JD Hill, as well. So we've been very fortunate to have that level of kind of involvement with the project. The HDR students, just summarised here, working on different aspects of the project. Nicola Froggatt has actually submitted, working with Gay and at the British Museum. And so we've had a range of students ongoing as well, working on different aspects of the collection. They're really kind of a really important part of the life of the project. In terms of methods, I guess the methods are fairly diverse, but on one level, they involve visiting and investigating collections to open them up. So physically visiting collections in Europe and elsewhere in Australia where we can. If we can't visit them, and increasingly in the last year and a half, trying to make digital collections, so actually getting CSV files and other catalogues and trying to integrate those into the project as well. In collections and catalogues, making comparisons between objects and items, recording some aspects of the objects themselves in collections and their conditions, feeding it into our database, which we'll come to, perhaps making a photographic record, and just generally communicating and opening up conversations regarding collections with various stakeholders. And part of that opening up of conversations has been to hold a series of knowledge exchange events. There's been one major one each year. The first one at the British Museum in 2017. The second one in Albany, working on natural history collecting, which led to this volume of studies in Western Australian history, collecting natural history in Western Australia. Another knowledge exchange event held here in Perth, looking at cultural collections and their significance, co-hosted with the Burt Museum at UWA, and a range of obviously other forms of public engagement, public talks, lectures such as this, our websites, which you should go to have a look at some of the essays that we have there, and providing policy advice, leading to exhibition content, digital exhibitions as well. We were able to feed into the Bullabardip development by helping to curate a series of cases that tell the story of I guess, collecting the West. And these are installed in the historic Hackett Hall, the Stan Perrin WA Treasures Gallery at the WA Museum. So I'd encourage you to have a look at that when you get a chance as well. So cross-cutting all of these activities are a range of themes. And so we can think about obviously periods, pre-colonial, colonial, 20th century, etc. And we can also think about the context in which collecting occurred, from exploration through to entrepreneurial collecting, the role of missionaries, issues such as the rise of specialist disciplines such as anthropology or geology, Indigenous agency, and as we'll talk about, the values that sit around collections as well. But before we do that, I just want to bring in Toby to talk a little bit about NodeGoat, and we'll come back to some of our findings. So hopefully we'll be able to hear.
My name's Toby Burrows, and this presentation is about the Collecting the West project. An important strand of this Collecting the West project involves gathering data, particularly about objects from Western Australia, which are now in collections in the United Kingdom, Europe and North America, and in the eastern states of Australia, but also about objects imported into Western Australia from overseas and now in public collections. We are interested in all kinds of objects, Indigenous objects, as well as natural history specimens and geological specimens. And we're constructing a single database to analyse and explore the data. The software we're using is called NodeGoat, developed by Lab 1100 in the Netherlands. It has a flexible approach to data modelling and enables batch importing and exporting of data. It also produces visualizations of the data in the form of maps and network graphs. Data can be imported in the form of CSV files. This one comes from the Kew Herbarium in London and shows plant specimens collected by William Harvey in Western Australia in 1854. The specimens are now part of the Kew Herbarium's collections. This is the main screen in NodeGoat for browsing all the objects included in the database so far. It gives a summary of each object's information. You can see there are different kinds of objects in various different current locations and collections. You can see the sub-objects in a bit more detail here. This specimen was collected in 1697 by the Dutch explorer Vlaming and subsequently travelled to Jakarta, Amsterdam and Paris before reaching its current location, Geneva, in 1847. Each object can have an image attached or a link to an image on the web. This is an illustration from 1768 showing the Vlaming specimen. It's the upper one of the two plants. I mentioned that NodeGoat does map-based visualizations. This one shows the various places associated with the history of the Vlaming specimen. There's a time slider which can be used to show its history at any given point in time. This filter produces a list of 96 objects created before 1830. They are a mixture of plant specimens and indigenous objects, now in collections across Europe. You could then sort the list into date order if you wanted to. And this is the map-based visualization of the histories of those 96 objects created before 1830. The database is not yet publicly available, but you can see some of the objects through the Collecting the West website. These are essays produced by Collecting the West researchers and delivered from the NodeGoat database. Assembling the data is far from straightforward. There are many uncertainties and gaps in the source data. Chronology is particularly important for the visualizations, but is often poorly documented in museum databases. Locations are also important, but these are rarely given as places with geo-coordinates. Getting the full data can be difficult, and there is little consistency between institutions, as well as hardly any use of standard identifiers for people and places. Nevertheless, we're very pleased that the new Western Australian Museum building, which is opening in November, will be displaying some of our animations of the history and movement of objects and specimens over the centuries.
So for the last part of the discussion, we just really want to start talking a bit more about some of our research under several headings. So first off, one of the things we're looking at is really the significant stories that emerge from 18th and 19th century collections, initially of what we might think of as forms of natural history. So for instance, we have this expeditionary phase where vessels visiting the West Australian coast begin the task of using collection amongst other means to begin to understand Western Australia. So particularly the voyages of Philip Parker King and his crews, John Septimus Roe and Alan Cunningham, both collecting as well, led to collections that mostly ended up back in London and coming through, I guess, the mechanisms of the Royal Navy. We also have other European nations visiting Western Australia. We've already mentioned Vlaming and the Dutch, but of course the French very famously conducting serious expeditions driven by Enlightenment values, in which collecting and documenting natural and cultural diversity were key principles. So natural history specimens abound in collections made by the French on the West Australian coast. In Western Australia itself, with the establishment of the colony, we start seeing very important collections being used for a range of purposes, for exhibition, for the development of social and moral institutions, forms of de facto travel, global learning, and economic and national promotion. So for instance, we have in the Swan River colony from after 1826 and 29, we have collections being used to maintain links with a form of home in Europe. So a collector such as George Fletcher Moore, and you can see here some of his records pertaining to obtaining material from Aboriginal people, from Noongar Whadjuk people. These are objects that ended up in Dublin. And so we see the ways in which objects can be used to maintain links with institutions and, in this case, the University of Dublin for Moore. We see people such as Thomas Hobbs Scott visiting briefly, really, the new colony and collecting geological samples largely from in and around Rottnest, Garden Island and the Swan River colony, and taking these to the one of the learned societies in London, the Geological Society, and presenting a paper on it and trying to figure out where these geological specimens fit in emerging debates regarding the origin of the planet. We have other collectors in the colony on a permanent basis, such as Georgiana Malloy, whose extraordinarily rich collections of botanical specimens from the southwest ended up also moving through circles of emerging botanical interest in London. Of course, in particular, the botany and all of these new species were of great burning interest to botanists in London post-Banks.
Right. So if in the early years of the colony, collecting was a way of maintaining relationships with a home that was elsewhere, in the second half of the 19th century, we begin to see the birth of collecting as a way of actually making a home in the colony. And of course, the museum associated with the Swan River Mechanics Institute is actually the first instance of this practice. It was established in 1851, and it was in fact driven by Septimus Roe, who was the colony's first surveyor. And you might remember the image of Septimus Roe in one of our earlier slides. Roe was steeped in Royal Navy networks, having been a Navy. Tiff, what was his rank? Can't remember his rank.
A midshipman.
Thank you. But anyway, I would argue that Roe needs to be understood as a collector as well as a surveyor. And thus he's absolutely key to understanding the relationship between collecting and the colonial enterprise. Roe was effectively one of, if not the leading intellectual in the colony. And he collected throughout his expeditions, remembering that he was a surveyor. So he was collecting geology, plants, animals, as well as indigenous material culture. And he also collected through his Imperial Navy networks. And that pottery that you can see there in the image is actually one of Roe's collected objects from Fiji via his Imperial Navy networks that he donated to the Perth Museum within the Swan River Mechanics Institute. So keen was he in collecting that he actually also, as a young naval officer, sent material back to his family in England to establish what was known as the Rovial Museum, so a family museum, the contents of which were later sold at auction. But in Perth, he was instrumental in establishing the Swan River Mechanics Institute and was a key donor to its collections. And many of the objects now form part of the WA Museum's collection and can in fact be seen in the Treasure Galleries exhibition that Al mentioned a little bit before. Other significant colonial collections that were very much part of making a home in the colony were the Nicolay Museum in the Fremantle prison, where the Reverend Nicolay was a chaplain, and eventually the government's own geological collection under the direction of Bernard Woodward. And geology was particularly important. If you kind of just simply remember how important mining is to Western Australia and Western Australia economy, well, it's from the 1850s onwards that in fact earlier with the examples that Al was showing, that people begin to collect geological specimens. And from the 1850s onwards, really the point of that is to educate people about the diversity of the geology of the colony and its potential interest for mining. So what eventually happens is, just before I say that, I think another really important collection is that of the police commissioner, Phillips. So what happened here was that Colonel Phillips, who was the commissioner of police in WA at the turn of the last century, late 19th century, early 20th century, his men throughout the colony, then the state, basically collected ethnographic material and as well as human remains across the state. Those three collections, the Mechanics Institute, the Phillips collection, and the geology collections of both the Nicolay and the government's geological collection, become the origins of the Western Australian Museum and Art Gallery.
you want me to go
Now-
back? Are you okay?
Yeah, no, I'm fine.
Yeah.
So we've been doing a little bit of work, particularly Al and I, on trying to understand how these early collecting practices actually produced value. But before I go there, yeah, you can kind of see in this quote, which is really an argument as to why the colony should have a museum. And I'll just read it out. When we remember the wonderful field which this colony opens to the geologist, botanist, zoologist, entomologist, and ethnologist, it may be pronounced truly surprising that no attempt should have been made to gather even an elementary collection of nature's marvels, which we are told are in no place more marvelous or interesting than on this side of Australia. So those three collections become the way of establishing an institution that does indeed cater to the geologist, the botanist, the zoologist, the entomologist, the ethnologist. And in so doing, tell a story about this place that is the most marvelous and interesting in Australia, according to the locals. So separatism goes a long way back in WA. All right, so as I was saying, Al and I have been doing some work trying to think through how value is actually produced in colonial contexts. And if we go to the very beginnings of the WA Museum and some of the other collectors operating at around the same time, we can begin to see what we think is a very interesting relationship between the practice of collecting and the kinds of meaning-making practices that accompany collecting activity, which then produce a notion of value. And we are arguing really that those notions of value are actually, in the case of WA, very closely associated with the history of colonialism in that place. They are actually extractive. It's not by accident that geological collections were so important in this early history of collecting, colonial collecting in the state. So we have, I think, an example with, I think the Tunny slide, Al. So here's an example where Tunny was employed by the Western Australian Museum as a collector, and he was paid half by the museum and half by Lord Walter Rothschild, an Englishman lord who was interested, who had his own kind of zoological natural history museum, which still exists over on the west side of England. I can't quite remember what the county is. Anyway, Tunny was basically sent to collect all that he could amongst natural history specimens. So you can see him here collecting birds. He also collected ethnographic material. And the point of collecting all that you could was in order to have material to exchange with other museums. So then we need to understand that kind of approach of collecting in a really extractive way, you know, massive hundreds of animals, hundreds of specimens. And the idea was to collect duplicates so that you could then send those duplicates off to other museums in the world, and then in return get things that you didn't have a budget to buy. So, And in the process, what you were also doing was gaining cultural status for yourself as the museum director, for your institution, and you were contributing to the production of new knowledge, because many of those specimens were in fact new species. So the work of classifying them took place in places like, say, the Smithsonian, and then who kept that specimen, but the Western Australian Museum would have its own duplicate copies of those specimens. We also can see that the kind of place of WA and the importance of WA within what was essentially a global economic system of exchange. So as an example, for example, there was a professor of zoology in Florence who had his own museum there, a man by the name of Giglioli, who some might know as also being interested in the collecting of ethnographic material. He actually visited the eastern states of Australia, not WA though. But Bernard Woodward, who was the director of the Western Australian Museum, would frequently exchange material with Giglioli, sending him natural history specimens and ethnographic material. And then Giglioli would send early Etruscan and early Roman archaeological material to Perth, which then became shown in the galleries in Perth. So one could say that there was an exchange between Indigenous Australian material, meaning both natural and ethnographic, for ancient European civilizations. We're also concerned with the history of the institutional history of museums in Perth. So we've been doing research into the history of the Perth site itself. We're interested in the development over time of specialized collections. So whereas Tanny was collecting both ethnographic and natural history specimens, but he was by no means a trained anthropologist. By the mid-20th century, we do have specific disciplines and professionalized curatorial positions developing. And the other thing that we're doing along the way is also to document and interpret the history of display, the uses of these collections to produce an idea of WA, the place, its culture, its peoples, its natural resources. Of course, the earliest versions of this was in fact the international exhibitions as well as the intercolonial exhibitions, and there is a rich photographic record, and we are beginning well on the way to piecing information as to how these objects displayed in these collections, that in these international exhibitions that you can see here, were actually collected, you know, and late on Phillips and the police commissioner is actually quite important here as well. Here are some images of early displays in the early art gallery, which was built, which was at that time connected to the museum. And you can see the importance of that idea of European civilization there in that previous slide. Sorry, most of them were plaster casts. And then here we have the sort of education of the local children into both European and Australian colonial art. As Melissa Harpley has said, you know, the exhibitions might have been somewhat static. They didn't have enough money to change them very frequently, but the train of collecting kept on rolling, adding carriages down the decades. Right.
Oh, yeah, I can jump in.
I think we're up to translocations, Al.
Yes, so and these are displays as well in the WA Museum from a similar era, and again very disciplinary. So quite a classic ways of displaying, very different to what you'll see in the contemporary museum today. So in terms of just kind of coming to a couple of final points, the issue of translocation. So what we're really interested in here, and this is a term introduced by Benedict Savoy, this idea that looking at the study of translocations, and what we're really interested in is a range of ways in which context are available around collections, particularly these collections which are on the move, right? So they're coming from places, they're moving through hands, they're ending up in displays and then moving into collections and storage and back into displays. And this is constant translocation and movement of collections occurring. And as we already have made this point, but you know, WA is just one node in essentially a vast global network through which collections of various types were exchanged. And so at that level, it becomes interesting to start to think not so much in quantitative terms, but more in qualitative terms about the ways in which collections played a role and the values, as Andrea has already suggested, the ways in which values shifted as they moved between these different types of contexts. So just some examples of ways of thinking about it once we start to pull together data that sits across I guess, natural history and ethnographic and other forms of collection. So looking, for instance, and this is fairly old data, so don't worry so much about the numbers here, but these are just to get us to think about the ways in which we can start to interrogate the data around WA's collections in this project. So for instance, looking at the ways in which archaeological and ethnographic collections occur in different places, the extent to which, you know, they're numerically present in places such as the British Museum or the Science Museum or what have you. In this case, dividing up very simply in the pie chart, you know, between anthropogenic and natural history collections, thinking about the sheer scale of material moving out from Western Australia. So we are starting to add places, institutions where collections from Western Australia exist, including some on the East Coast. Or that really needs to be another project in its own right, given the large amount of material that circulates also within Australia. And we can start to think about you know, institutions and I guess the chronological sequence of collecting. So, you know, when are major collections made? Where are they coming from? That's relevant both within Western Australia and equally in institutions elsewhere. So, for instance, we see certain institutions having peak periods where they're interested in certain types of collections. Ethnographic material is a great example of this. You know, the idea of cultural typologies, a very big part of the emergence of ethnographic museums in the late 1800s. And so we see an incredible demand globally for Indigenous people's material culture. This is an early form of world cultures driven by the growth in anthropology. So we can look at museums, in this case, Lund in Sweden, and actually start to think about, you know, what types of material went into that museum and when. And visualize those. And then we can look then at more broadly at trends across, let's say, for instance, the world in this case, and seeing, you know, again, where peak collections, the data here is actually spiking a lot of material in the late 1900s, and that's because that's the data we've put into this particular field. So it's actually not a real trend. It will be much more diverse than this, but you know, you can see that there is an opportunity to start thinking across institutions and comparing what's happening with them in terms of collecting. Equally, we can look at the I guess, start to visualize these in different ways. And Toby's already introduced the idea of the map. Here's taking that idea a little bit further and looking over time. This is not all of our data, but starting to see over time, starting in the early 1600s, we're now in the 1700s for those who are following the timeline at the bottom. And we can start to think, you know, where are things being collected from in Western Australia? Of course, concentrating first in the southwest and along Western Australia's coast, and then more as colonisation develops and we start to see collecting across the state. And of course, the movement of those materials, first initially primarily to Europe, but equally then to North America, with museums such as the Chicago and the Smithsonian becoming really important collectors of West Australia's natural history and Aboriginal materials. Within Western Australia, we can start to take this data apart again to think more about context. For instance, in this case, looking color coding according to where material from different parts of the Southwest are actually turning up in various museums. So the color here shows the places where material eventually ended up. And you can see, of course, the concentration in the Swan River colony. So these are just examples of thinking a little bit more about context, and this is something we're looking forward to do over the last year of the project, is starting to get into the data a bit more, to think about these forms of relocating, translocating, and where material is coming from and where it's going. Another example is this one here, which Andrea is going to talk to.
Okay, so this is Captain Matthew McVicker-Smythe, and he was a sales representative for Nobel Explosives. So he basically traveled the countryside in WA selling explosives for the then developing mining industry and the agricultural industry as well. And as he went, he too was a collector. And so he decided to collect basically specimens from every single mine that he visited. And eventually, can you go to the next slide? Thanks. He also started to collect ethnographic material from all the various places that he traveled in Western Australia. And then he would bring it all back to Perth. And as you can see, he had a private museum that basically showcased the geological specimens in the middle in order to showcase the richness and the potential of the mining industry to visitors. So in a way, you can sort of see this as an ad for Nobel Explosives. But then what is interesting is also to see the use of the ethnographic material of Indigenous material culture to, in a way, bolster that narrative, because what we then have in all the, as he traveled, all the local newspapers would say, oh, Captain Smythe is coming to town, and there would be various descriptions of his collecting activities. And you can see in the two examples that we have provided for you here, the kind of place of mining as the future of the state and just so important to the economy, and Indigenous material culture as something that was, by contrast, kind of, using his language, not mine, quaint and exotic. So you can see how what we actually have here is a collecting practice that provides that, because of its time and the context of the development of the mining industry, places, and you can see here just how much material he had and where he traveled. I mean, the man is everywhere, and you can see that the collecting of Indigenous material is co-located with the collecting of the geological material. So in other words, these two processes are happening at the same time. And it is the geological collection that, in a sense, gives the meaning of the ethnographic collection as something that belongs to the past and not to the future of Western Australia. And I guess our suggestion is that in many ways, this is the kind of collecting history of the colony and the ways in which many of the dominant narratives in Western Australia were actually produced. This is the origins of really many of our troubles.
So maybe, if it's okay, we'll just finish up here. I'm aware of time. So we've talked a little bit about context, just a couple of things that obviously we haven't had a chance to talk about, but one is kind of these forms of connection with community. There's a talk coming up about Clement, where we'll talk a little bit more about the ways in which, I guess, connections can be made with communities today and the power of those. So I'll leave that to a future presentation, but it's also integral to the work of people like Stephen Hopper and Lynette Knapp, for instance, in the Southwest, which you can see as well on the website. So these ideas of different shifts, the ways in which we can start to think about knowledge around collections is something hopefully that will come out in the talks ahead. And also the ways in which the project is leading on to new work. This is terribly embarrassing, isn't it, Tiff? I've put a picture up here. So, the work in Albany has been led. Tiff is leading work looking at, for instance, at those collections, and it's led to a new ARC project as well. So some of these things are kind of taking root and developing in new ways. So I'll leave it with a little plug here for next week's seminar. Gay Sculthorpe from the British Museum, talking about collections from the Swan River Colony, Nature, Methods and Motivations. And just a plug for the wonderful new book by Gay, Maria Nugent and Howard Morphy, launched by Julia Gillard in recent weeks, on another ARC project looking at the collections in the British Museum. I'm sure that will come up in her talk. So here's our little plug, and I'm going to take off the sharing screen and hand it over to Tiff.
Thanks, Andrea and Al. It was really great to get that overview of the project and the work that's been going on, and some of the outputs as well, and future directions too. So yeah, I'm just going to manage the chat here, and if you've got, we've only got about 6 or so minutes left of the session, but if you've got any questions, please just raise your hand or write something in the chat.
I'm glad we filled up the hour then.
I've got a question just to begin before others, if they're just still thinking about the ways in which the project or the kind of opportunities and impacts of this project that it's having on the institutions, the partner organisations that are involved. What are the kind of opportunities for these institutions from the research that's been happening in the project?
I don't know who's here from the partners, but I don't know if JD wants to say something or. He's thinking.
I think Gay is the best person to speak in terms of the British Museum.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, I guess it's through these partnerships that's enabled much more work to be done on collections here, and very specifically because of the linkage with the project, we were able to get one collaborative doctoral award here at the British Museum, which was Nicola Froggatt was the student who was successful. So her work has involved investigating further the Western Australian collections, not just in the British Museum, but across the United Kingdom. So she's just submitted her thesis. So these sorts of partnerships allow us to get additional resources to better document our own and other collections here in the UK. So that's one very practical outcome. And more generally, through our partnerships and participation in seminars and projects, such as the Ullman exhibition, certainly making the collections from Western Australia here in the British Museum much better known to communities. So just the general awareness is very important with work going forward.
Thanks, Gay.
Deb has a question in the chat. So, which is, I have a question about the policy advice that is mentioned as arising from the project. Is the policy advice given regarding the state policy concerning these collections or the individual organisations? So, Deb, as part of our work, we have sort of, I suppose, I'm not quite sure whether I would say it's advice or it's more like there are conversations that might then have an impact in how institutions do various things. So, for example, we had an event at the State Library in Perth around contemporary collecting, and that is helping to inform the development of new collection policies at the State Museum. Or we have been working on an audit of Aboriginal collections and the history of collecting practices of that material at the State Library. And that report will, there will be recommendations based on that work, and that report will feed into the library's new collection policy as well. So it's that kind of relationship.
Mm-hmm. We had also a session on cultural diversity and collecting cultural diversity across all the partners at one stage, which was quite interesting. And also with AGWA, I don't think Melissa's here, but we've been involved in kind of looking at kind of radical departures and kind of in terms of Agwa's history to tell a new kind of timeline story as well. Less policy, but I guess surveying policy over time, or where it exists or where it doesn't, in relation to Agwa is another project that will be coming out on their platform, on their digital platform throughout the year. And it's nice to know that Daniel is going. If you can have a look at the Archdeacon Scott's letters, as you say in the chat, Daniel, yeah, would welcome that.
Yeah, I thought that was quite funny that you brought that up today, because he collected a spear thrower and also some things from Sydney, which I'm trying to work out what happened there. But yeah, I'll send you the things through.
Thanks, Daniel. It's one of the nice things about this project. Various people come in and, you know, have interests that connect with ours. And so there might be the people who are formal CIs and PIs, but there's a whole bunch of other people who connect with us in various interesting ways.
Any further questions? I can't see anyone's hands up here. Just having a look.
I've got one question.
Great, Gay.
What will be the legacy of all the node goat data?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I think the point about it being, I always stress that issue about it being qualitative rather than quantitative, because, you know, we're not trying to capture everything. We're trying to look at the, you know, trends in the data. So I think the big outcome will be the knowledge that's produced around data. I think that, you know, I think that's where we can kind of do most of our emphasis. At the end of the project, obviously, we'll keep NodeGoat going, I think, as an active research space, and continue to talk to the people who have those collections regarding making that more and more open. I think that would be a useful research tool. And we're kind of hoping that later projects would actually just carry on with that database and keep it going. But ultimately, of course, if you were to close down any research database like that, we would export it out in some format to the partner organisation, so that there is obviously a kind of an ultimate collection of that information. But hopefully, I'd like to see NodeGoat keep on going. I think we're quite excited by it. It's such a, I can see that we have our NodeGoat friends here in the chat. So you could probably talk a little bit about what's happened with other projects, Geert, or if you have a couple of minutes, are you able to do that? Unless it's just his computer and he's fully silent.
No, I'm here. So I have a mic. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Hi.
Yeah, I did it. Hi, I didn't set up my my video. Sorry, I wasn't expecting this, but it's completely right what Al mentioned. So we always hope that projects will continue, but NodeGoat allows for a complete export of the data. So we always encourage research projects that do end to make a full export of the data and store that in a repository like Zenodo or a national repository, so the data remains accessible in its own. So that's a very important aspect for every project that is creating a data set, that this data set remains open and accessible for a longer period, also at the end of the project.
Thanks, Geert. I mean, I think just finally as well on that, you know, obviously research projects don't set out to do to create massive databases, but if they may lead to, you know, the creation of more permanent cross-institutional archives, then I think we always wanted to basically use whatever we were going to do in this project. We never started out thinking about NodeGoat. They joined us along the way. So it's really more of a tool to basically illustrate the power of looking at collections using these types of database and networked approaches more than anything. So hopefully something will come out of it.
Well, it's gone 7 o'clock just now, so I think we might have to leave it there. But thanks so much for that great beginning to the seminar series, and yeah, really looking forward to next week to Gay Sculthorpe's presentation. And thanks everyone for coming. That was great.
Thanks, Tiff.
Yes, thanks everybody.